Hello, I'm Joan Williams, Distinguished Professor of Law at University of California, Hastings College of the Law, and this is What Works for Women. Unfortunately, gender bias is still commonplace. In fact, 68% of women say they believe that gender bias still exists in today's workplace. And here's why. Do you feel more comfortable with people like yourself? If you think someone's smart, do you tend to overlook their little stumbles? When a woman has a baby, do you worry that she's not going to be quite as committed as she was before to her career? If you answered yes to any of those, and most of us would, then your outlook is framed by what's called implicit bias, unconscious bias. Implicit bias is driven by schemas, and schemas are expectations associated with members of a group that guide perceptions of that group. And schemas drive stereotyping. Here are some schemas that are common in the sciences. If you ask people to free associate, scientist, immediate associations, here are some of the things that they say. If you ask people immediate association, what are their associations with the typical woman, here are some of the things that they say. And if you ask somebody to free associate, what are your associations with the typical mother, here's what they say, and you see there's very little overlap between scientist and typical woman or scientist and typical mother. So there's a real lack of fit between the way women are seen and the way scientists are seen. And that is the schema that drives a lot of this stereotyping. Schemas affect evaluations often very profoundly. For example, for all classical musical lovers, I wonder if you have noticed that it's only very recently that women have started to appear in significant numbers in classical orchestras. And in fact, that's because auditions began to be held behind a screen, so you couldn't tell whether the musician was a man or a woman. And when they adopted that practice, there was a 25 to 46% increase in the number of women in orchestras. So that shows you some of the strength of these implicit biases. Implicit biases often have small effects, but small effects create large effects over time. There's a famous computer simulation study that dramatizes this and really shows that mountains are made out of these little molehills. And so the bottom line is that women need to be politically savvier than men, which is why I have created a series of tools to help women out. You have the academics studies on the one side over here, and the successful and savvy women over here. And what I have done is to bring those two elements together in two products. One is called Gender Bias Bingo. You see the website there. And the newer one, which is the one I'm talking about today, is the New Girls Network. The New Girls Network, as I've mentioned, is based on 127 interviews of women, highly successful women, 60 of them women of color scientists. The first of the four patterns is called Prove It Again. And if we look at my study of 127 women, 60% reported having experienced Prove It Again. Now, Prove It Again stems from, remember, that lack of fit. Since there is a lack of fit, women often have to provide more competence, more evidence of competence than men in order to be seen as equally competent. So, for example, women often are judged on their achievements in contexts where men are judged on their potential. So he's engaged in research that will take longer to reach the publication world, but she just has no publications. Women's successes are interpreted differently than men's. Often women's successes are attributed to luck or other outside causes, whereas men's are attributed to skill or other internal causes. And women's mistakes, on the other hand, are noticed more and often remembered longer than men's are. And then there's what's called leniency bias, where objective requirements often are applied rigorously to women but leniently to men. So one professor didn't follow all of the rules in requesting some equipment, and a ton of bricks came down on her head. She said, I just saw 5 men do it exactly that way, but the rules were applied rigorously to her. Women also encountered polarized evaluations, so that women superstars often actually get even higher evaluations than men, but women just a notch below often get much lower evaluations than similarly situated men. One overriding issue is illustrated by the following quote. I think gender biases work differently for women of different groups. It's not just heightened for other women. That was a woman in a focus group. There's actually a separate video on how the experience of gender bias differs by race. That's called Double Jeopardy. Now, as we proceed from the discussion of the prove it again pattern, I'm going to proceed from that to discussion of what to do if you meet prove it again. And so that's really a discussion of individual strategies. It's very important to recognize individual strategies are not solutions. The solutions are organizational change to eliminate the gender bias. But until that happens, and unfortunately it's happening fairly slowly, here are some strategies that work. So those are prove it again patterns. How about some strategies? The first is, if you have to prove it again, just to prove it again. That unfortunately is sad but true. It's very important though not to prove it again so much that you burn out. Another important strategy is to keep careful real-time, very important, real-time records of your accomplishments. Because if you're going to have to provide more evidence of your accomplishments, then you have to have that evidence at your fingertips. It's very important also to build a network, because if somebody's holding you to a different standard and you have a mentor or an ally who can say, oh, let's go back, I don't think we're applying the same standard, that's clearly the best way to solve this problem. But if you have to do this yourself because you have no one else to do it for you, one way to approach it is just to say, can you help me understand how my situation is different from Jim's? And you notice the tone control there. For senior women, as I mentioned, if you see different standards being applied, you just say, let's, if that's the standard we're going to use, let's go to the top of the pile and just make sure we have applied it consistently. So that's prove it again. Here's the second class ceiling pattern, the tightrope. The tightrope emerges because high status jobs are not only male, they're also masculine. So women have to behave in masculine ways in order to be taken seriously. But if they behave too masculinely, then we know what that's called. The tightrope is very common. In fact, it was the most common experience among the 127 women I talked to. Nearly 3/4 had experienced the tightrope. More to feminine problems than to masculine problems, but a lot of them both. And what happens in the tightrope is that women have to walk a tightrope between being seen as too masculine or as too feminine. Here's an example, a quote from MIT. To get ahead here, you have to be aggressive. But if women are too aggressive, then they're ostracized. And if they're not aggressive enough, then they have to try twice as hard and do twice the work. So that's the tightrope. Okay, here's some common tightrope too feminine problems. Being super deferential and self-effacing often undercuts one's authority. Doing the office housework often because you're under a lot of pressure to do that. Playing the office mother for either colleagues or students. And then sometimes women are under pressure to be sort of the dutiful daughter. So those are all very common to feminine problems. On the other hand, if women behave in a way that's direct, outspoken, assertive, competitive, then they run into the other side of the tightrope, to masculine problems. So if you're stern or you say no, said one woman, then the immediate reaction is to say that woman is a bitch, right? If it's a man, it's just a no. So there you see that identical behavior is being interpreted very differently for men than for women. Another common too masculine problem concerns showing anger. studies show that open displays of anger increase the perceived status of a man, but decrease the perceived status of a woman. Women also have problems around self-promotion. Women often receive pushback for self-promotion, stronger actually from other women than from men, but strong from both. Here are some tightrope strategies. The basic meta answer is, if you are going to be penalized for being too masculine or too feminine, to find your own mix of the masculine and the feminine. And if you look at professional women around you, often they have done this in a very savvy way. Now, beyond that, how about those too feminine problems? For example, using verbal hedges, or ending every sentence with a question mark, not claiming your seat at the table, standing like this instead of like this, not power posing. I think of these now as the lean-in problems. And Sheryl Sandberg has given very good advice that women need to lean in. On the other hand, there are a lot of other challenges that women face. For example, what happens when you're assigned an endless stream of office housework, whether that be committee work or being a service partner or whatever it is? One important strategy is to just say no. You can't do all of that devalued work and expect to advance, because it's devalued. It may be important, but it's devalued. But how do you say no? You have to be picky, but here's a good way, if somebody's giving you lots of that kind of work, just to say, you've given me this and this and this, and I think they're very important as well. Let's talk about what your priorities are. Another strategy we call power to the posse, and that addresses the self-promotion problem. So if you form a group, preferably of men as well as women, and you celebrate each other's achievements, that can dodge the self-promotion problem that women often face. Another strategy is to praise the team, if you're a senior woman, although make it clear that you led the team. In addition, if you feel you need to get angry, and sometimes you do need to draw the line, here's one way to do it. If I look angry, it's because I am angry. And it's because of, and then name a shared goal. Give the outside attribution. You're angry for an objective reason. The third pattern is the maternal wall. If we look at the interviews, 59% of the mothers reported hitting the maternal wall. And this maternal wall bias is very, very strong. The classic study involved identical resumes, but the mother was 79% less likely to be hired, only half as likely to be promoted, offered an average of $11,000 less in salary. These were management consultants, and held to higher performance and punctuality standards. In other words, motherhood triggers very strong negative competence and commitment assumptions. You also see hostile prescriptive bias. That's the should bias. Here's an example, actually an example from the chair of a women's tenure committee. Why don't you just go home and have some more babies rather than worrying about tenure? Prescriptive bias in a different tone of voice is, well, I didn't offer you this fellowship because I know it's not a good time for you. Same message. That's not what mothers should be doing, but this time it's in a benevolent tone of voice. Descriptive bias stems from how mothers, the typical mother, is seen to behave. Quote, as the mother of 2 infants, she had responsibilities that were incompatible with those of a full-time academician. That quote is actually from a lawsuit with a reported tentative settlement of nearly $500,000. Another maternal wall pattern is called attribution bias. The professor is not in their office. If it's a man, he's giving a paper. If it's a woman, the assumption might be she's with her children. Bias avoidance is also very strong on campuses. Here's a quote, "At my campus, most women are afraid to even admit that they have children." Obviously, they're sensing this maternal wall bias. The maternal wall bias is matched by what I call the frigid climate for fathers. What you really have is women being policed into caregiving roles and men being policed into breadwinner roles. And here's evidence. 40% of academic fathers did not ask to stop the tenure clock for a new child, even though they said it would have helped them to do so. Here's some maternal wall strategies, but first, some things are illegal. Denying parental leave to either men or women is illegal. So is discouraging them from taking it or penalizing them for doing so. So is requiring women to find their own maternity leave replacements, or in fact, treating a man's request for leave any differently than women's requests. Okay, transitioning to individual strategies. After you have children, and indeed after you have your second or third child, it's also important, if you intend to pursue your career, say so. If you're willing to travel, say so. If you're the primary earner, say so. And if your partner is willing to follow you, say so, because if you don't say so, people will assume the opposite. That's the descriptive bias. You can counter both descriptive bias and that benevolent bias with counter information. So in order to head off the I didn't consider you for the fellowship because it's not a good time for you, you can say, I'm back from maternity leave, I am raring to go, I would love to be considered for that fellowship and lots of new work. How about prescriptive bias? What if somebody says, I don't know how you could leave your children, my wife could never do that. What I recommend here is what I call the Tolstoy is wrong approach. Just say very mildly, you know, I guess that's really right for her, but people are really different, and this is what's right for my family. The final pattern we call tug of war. It's when gender bias against women turns into fights among women. And this type of pattern is commonplace, but it's less common than the other ones are. My interview suggested, found that 55% of the women I interviewed had encountered it. Now, it's important to recognize that in some workplaces this doesn't exist. Here's an example. The women faculty members I've met who have been older than me have always been very encouraging, very helpful, and very kind. And you do find those workplaces and you do find those women faculty members. It's very important to stress that. On the other hand, here's quite a different experiences. Opportunities for women are very zero-sum here, said one informant. If one woman gets a prized position or assignment, that means another woman won't. And so it breeds a sense of competition. There, again, there's gender bias in the environment. There's tokenism, room for only one woman. But notice how it translates into fights between the women. Sometimes women are harder on other women because either they think, well, it's a tough world out there and I have to help her along, or they think that's the way I came up, so isn't that the way she should come up? That's another common tug-of-war pattern. And they're the patterns I call the fights between the tomboys and the femmes. Here's an example. I've seen lots of senior women behave that way. And it's not even just as far as working long hours, but even having male mannerisms and being sort of aggressive and not putting up with any crap and almost having a chip on their shoulder and also going out of their way not to mentor younger women. I think of this now as the sort of Marissa Mayer, I'm not a girl at Google, I'm a geek at Google. There are studies that show that women who experience gender bias early in their careers tend to distance themselves from other women and assimilate more to the men. On the other hand, this is a very different approach. Another woman said, I'm on kind of a backlash mission. I wear dresses, I bake cookies for my group meetings, I bring my child to class. I've just stuck it out there and said, I'm a woman, I'm someone's mother, and I'm not going to compete as a boy because I'm not a boy. So in this environment where you have to decide how masculine and how feminine you're going to play it, or that your identity is, sometimes those kinds of women end up, the femmes and the tomboys end up in conflict. And then finally there are the mommy wars. The mommy wars may be between mothers who did just ran their careers very much as the men did, and say, you know, I worked long hours and my kids are fine, I don't know why you need to take a career break or take parental leave or whatever. And then there's sometimes conflicts between mothers and the childless women, women who wanted to have children but couldn't, usually because of the time clock of male careers, or child-free women, women who never wanted to have children and may feel the mothers are just reinforcing stereotypes, for example, that women need special treatment. With all of those patterns, it's very important to recognize that they are the result of gender discrimination, not proof that this isn't a gender problem. So let's look at some individual strategies if you meet up with them. Very important, there's no wrong way to be a woman. And it's very important not to judge each other saying as if there were one right way to be a woman. It's also important to recognize the limits of sisterhood. Some women are just apples and oranges. They are very, very different. We don't expect all men to be the same, and we shouldn't expect all women. Nor should we really expect all women always to support each other. Men don't support each other always, and you know, women are people and they won't either. Now to some key strategies. Make an enemy into an ally. Like, how do you do that? If somebody is undercutting you or otherwise you're having a lot of conflict, you simply go to them and say, you know, if I've done anything to offend you, I'm really sorry. I have a very high opinion of you and I want us to be good colleagues, and what can I do to help us get on a path to set this right? For senior women, it's very important to remember that the younger women's experience is very different from yours. They came along at quite a different time. And for junior women, it's very important to remember that the senior women may not have as much power as you think they have, and that may be one of the reasons they're not helping you as much as you think they ought to. A very important strategy is simply to get women working together with other women, not necessarily on women's issues, because remember, there's some women who don't want to be associated with women's issues, but just working together on something that's shared. So in conclusion, it's very important for women to realize that behind every successful woman, man for that matter too, there's a string of failures. Bad things happen to successful people. Resilience is very important. And I always think of this in terms of two metaphors, the terrier and the stream. You give me a goal and I will get it in my mouth and I will worry it and never give up. And I'm also a stream where if there's an obstacle, I'm water and it's just a rock. So you go around it. Thank you and good luck.